Hello, this is David Bernstein. I'm the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. I'm very delighted to be here with my partner in thought crime, Brandy Shufutinsky. Hi, Brandy.
Hi, David.
All right. So we're going to hit another uncontroversial topic today in our sort of nuanced, I hope, way. And it is around the Florida social studies standard and the portrayal of African American history that really came out, I think, like a week and a half ago. And I'll do my best to sort of summarize what I think the controversy is. Brandy, you perhaps you'll correct me about it. Maybe express a few of my own editorial opinions along the way, and then let's really dig in. So, what happened? There was a new Florida social studies standards that came out that portrayed Black history and slavery, and we, of course, predictably, there was a controversy immediately because there was one line in a rather extensive curriculum. There were probably a few other things that caused some controversy as well, but there was especially one line that suggested that slaves benefited with trade skills that they then used after they left. And we'll look at the exact quote in a second. We don't have to do that this second. We'll come back to it when we sort of dissect it. That they were able to use the skills that they gained during slavery for post-slavery and when they were able to work as free men and women. And of course, you can imagine what people said. They're saying that this is sort of Jim Crow ideology. One person used that term with me. That they're saying that this all just benefited slaves, and it was a sort of whitewashing, if you will, of slavery and the history around slavery. I'm always, Brandy, very suspicious whenever I see a controversy that emerges around Florida, because in almost every single one, the mainstream press or the progressive social media mob or whoever you're talking about usually do not characterize it in all its complexity. So you have things like don't say gay, and they made it out to be as if it was some effort to prevent people from saying the word gay, when it was, of course, much more complex than that. Doesn't mean I'm siding with DeSantis when I say that, or Florida as I say that. I think Florida's been wrong, and DeSantis has been wrong about several things, particularly the idea that we shouldn't discuss divisive concepts, as they might call it. And so I have my critiques of Florida, but I also realize that a lot of what comes out about Florida and takes center stage tends to be sort of inflated and hyperbolic. And I think we should be very careful before we ever believe anything. So I wanted to initially just sort of ask myself the question and then try to answer it over time. Sometimes it takes a little time. What happened here? It's reminiscent a bit of whatever Israel's in a conflict in Gaza, and there's some bombing that took civilian lives in Gaza. And immediately people start blaming Israel, and that's the discourse. And then once you actually look at what happened closely, and there's a UN investigation or whatever, oftentimes you find out it actually didn't happen that way. Maybe it had been friendly fire from Hamas, or maybe there was some error on the part of an Israeli military officer, but it wasn't done intentionally. I mean, it's always like that. And I find that here too, is that there's this presumption that it's going to be evil and that this is Jim Crow ideology. And so therefore we can say whatever we want, even if it's not true or even if it's inflated. Since that time, of course, there were some more sober analyses that came out. Cathy Young wrote a very important article. Dan, maybe you could put up the quote, sorting out Florida teaching about slavery mess. Here's a quote from her I thought was very good. Incorporating such a framework into lessons for kids can be dicey. One has to walk a fine line between presenting slaves as just victims and implying that slavery wasn't so bad. Exactly. It requires careful thought. Maybe this quote that was in the Florida curriculum didn't do it justice. Dan, let's look at that quote real quickly, the actual offensive piece. Examine the various duties and trades performed by slaves: agricultural work, painting, carpentry, tailoring, domestic service, blah, blah, blah. Instruction includes how slaves develop skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. So that got people really, in an uproar. Now, interestingly, of course, that language was not, or similar language has been used elsewhere, including in blue state curricula that are around slavery. So Dan, put up the one in the African American AP studies. This is an AP studies course that Florida initially rejected, okay, and that everybody else hailed as an important piece of scholarship and curricula. In addition to the agricultural works, enslaved people learned specialized trades and worked as painters, carpenters, tailors, musicians, and healers in the North and South. Once free, African Americans used these skills to provide for themselves and others. Very similar, strikingly similar to the quote that was attributed to Florida. So it makes me think that even if one is critical of that, I think you can be critical of it. I think there's a case to be made. You can also be quite overblown. Now, as you might expect, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the New York Times writer who was behind the 1619 Project, also weighed in and, slammed, of course, DeSantis and so forth. But then she did something interesting. She did this analysis on Twitter about comparing the discussion of slavery in the curriculum to the discussion of the Holocaust. Here's one part of that Twitter thread, and it says, in the Holocaust section, there's no comparison and cataloging of other genocides being committed by and against other groups. The Holocaust stands on its own, as it should. In fact, the only reference to past times and other people is to describe the root of anti-Semitism. Okay, so she's saying basically that slavery is used as some sort, is treated as banal, as happening in other parts of the world, whereas the Holocaust is treated as it should be, as a unique historical event. And by the way, I think her inquiry here is fair. Like, it's fair to go about comparing them. They are not the exact same events, and they don't, and they should be understood in different ways. But, and I'm sure Brandy, you're going to tell me what your thinking is here in a second. But I do think it's fair to do that comparison. And I don't think we have a visual here, but there's another point where Nicole Hannah-Jones says that within the slavery curriculum, you talk about the sort of abolitionist heroes, the white heroes who helped push back against slavery, whereas in the Holocaust curriculum, we never talk about, as we often do, the righteous Gentiles who intervened, people like Schindler and Sugihara and others who came in and intervened and to save Jews. And it may be that the Holocaust curriculum, I didn't really check this, it doesn't really do that in Florida, but to me that's an oversight of the Holocaust curriculum, because clearly there's a huge emphasis on the role of the righteous Gentile. I mean, anyone has to do is go into sort of Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Museum, and you can see the role that righteous Gentiles play in the collective Jewish imagination around the Holocaust. That is something definitely emphasized in general, if not in the Florida curriculum. So while and then I want one more thing before I turn it over to Brandy. John McWhorter also wrote a piece about it in the New York Times, and Dan, maybe you could put that up. He said he was talking about this one quote. He said, "Look, if you read the whole curriculum, you would realize that this wasn't the tone of the whole curriculum. It was really an indictment of slavery." So he said, instead, it was just one passage amid hundreds of others, which constitutes an almost exhaustive coverage of the gruesomeness of slavery in the United States. Taken together, they are such an informed recitation of our racist past that is almost surprising DeSantis would approve them. So he's critical of DeSantis here, but he says, but this curriculum was true to what happened during that time. So Brandy, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know that was a mouthful, but I really wanted to just lay it all out there. What do you make of all this?
I think it's an example of the issues with forming opinion based on sound bites, in all honesty, because looking at the comparison of the African American Studies AP course that people on the political left were outraged that Governor DeSantis would want, send back for revisions, and it holding the same standard that then they chose to criticize when Governor DeSantis wanted to highlight, almost a verbatim standard, shows the ridiculousness of opinion forming based on sound bites. But before I get into that any further, I want to address what Nicole Hannah-Jones said. first of all, her assumption then is that how Holocaust studies or education is taught and curricula are taught in schools is correct. I take issue with. There are a lot of Jewish scholars, Holocaust studies scholars that actually take issue that the Holocaust curricula that we see in a lot of schools isn't deep enough so that it doesn't cover the righteous amongst the nations, that it doesn't cover the very real people, that non-Jews who actually stood up against the Nazis and against Hitler and against the mass murder of Jews. And it needs to do that. But a better critique, or maybe more important critique that I've seen, comes from a scholar who talks about her issue with the Holocaust curricula that we see in schools, that it takes the Holocaust as a singular issue and it doesn't address what led up to it, right, which this curriculum in Florida does. So, and I mean, that's Dr. Nye-elect speaks about it all of the time, that when we teach the Holocaust, we have to teach about all of the anti-Semitism that led up to such an atrocity. And I don't think bringing in issues as far as whether any other forms of slavery in any other places and how that led to the chattel slavery system that we saw here in the United States, that's actually a good thing. That's what happens when you actually are trying to teach and not just brainwash kids to a particular ideology. And the other point I want to make is that there is a difference between saying that people benefited from something and people were expressed resilience and found benefit in spite of something. Yes. And I believe that that distinction is made, and it's up to educators to continue making that distinction. Yes, people, slaves faced incredible brutality, and even under those horrible conditions, were able to express resilience and empower themselves. Not everybody, we know that already.
Sure.
And figure out a way to get through such an atrocity with something that when they gained emancipation, they were then able to use to build communities and families and themselves up.
Yeah. The great Viktor Frankl wrote the book, Man's Search for Meaning, and in it he talks about how certain people in Auschwitz and other concentration camps kept their sense of meaning alive, and that became a source of resilience in the most extreme circumstances. Somebody, by the way, I thought smartly, a Jewish woman said, I'm pretty sure that Jews learned some skills during Auschwitz. I'm pretty sure also that they didn't like it. In other words, a fact is a fact. It doesn't mean that it doesn't rehabilitate the morality of slavery to say that. It just says that there are certain things that happen. The other point I want to make, and I think this is absolutely critical and is often missing in this discussion, is that of course chattel slavery was a horrible evil, and the Holocaust were horrible evils, and they both happened, right? That is unquestionable. They both happened. That said, within each there are interpretive frameworks. There are ways of looking at things that can and should be debated. So you talked about what Dr. Nye-elect said about understanding the anti-Semitism that led up to it. Daniel Goldhagen wrote a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And it was a book about how ordinary Germans were complicit in the murderous campaign of the Nazis. And he claims that anti-Semitism had deep history within Germany. Yet there were other historians who took issue with Dan Goldhagen's portrayal. And they said, well, yeah, of course, there has always been a history of anti-Semitism, but Nazism was a break from that. It wasn't the same old anti-Semitism. And actually, this was new and the like. Now, we could debate that, all day till the cows come home. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a legitimate discussion to be had there. And I'm sure within slavery there is as well. There are issues about how to talk about things, what to leave out of the narrative and what to leave in. And that's why I'm not upset that Nicole Hannah-Jones did that comparison, because I think it can show you how things are portrayed differently. Are we to look at, for example, and this really gets complicated in my own mind, I have to admit, like the founders of this country, like Thomas Jefferson and others who did have slaves, are we to look at them in the exact same way as we look at the Nazis who perpetrated the extermination of Jews? How should history reflect on their very difficult to understand tolerance of the institution of slavery. And I think those are really important issues to discuss and debate. And I realize that they do get reflected in curricula. Thoughts?
My thoughts are, I do take issue with Nicole Hannah-Jones bringing up the Holocaust. There's no reason to, and this may come, to me, it's a little bit personal as someone who's Black, descended from slaves, and someone who's Jewish. There's no comparison that needs to be made between those two evils. And the knee-jerk reaction to constantly compare and contrast is ridiculous. And for Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is not a historian, and I argue not a scholar, to bring up a really, lazy argument about defending her stance on the Black history and Black studies curricula coming out of Florida is just to what I see as a knee-jerk reaction, an excuse that, oh, look, but the Jews do it this way and they get this and that and we don't. And I think it's uncalled for. It's unnecessary, and it doesn't advance an argument. I think that a lot of what her, so-called scholarship is lazy.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. A lot of her so-called scholarship is lazy. The question, look, yes, obviously comparing events can be dicey, but it's not just the comparing of events here; it's the comparing of how we teach the two things. And can we learn from how one event is taught versus how another event is taught?
I hope so. I mean,
right.
to me, what it shows is that how we teach about the Holocaust should be better, because it should be deeper. It shouldn't be as narrow. And this isn't saying that the anti-Semitism of the Nazis was the same as the anti-Semitism seen in decades, past, or the decades that preceded that. It's not about the same. They follow on a specific timeline. Like these events happened and they were sparked and caused by a certain ideology that ended up leading to the systemic extermination of people on a continent and a region. And I always argue, I mean, I have a few issues with how Holocaust curricula are formed. One being that they only focus on the World War II years, maybe a couple of years ahead of that in the 30s, when in fact we can go back further and see what led up to it. And they also ignore what happened in Arab and Muslim countries at the same time, that there were actual concentration camps there in North Africa, and there were Jews that lived in those places that were sent to these camps, and that isn't taught in much of a Holocaust curricula that's in our public schools.
Yeah. Like all of these historical events, especially of the magnitude of the Holocaust or chattel slavery in America, it's interesting about to what degree do you compare. Now, I studied under the great philosopher Emil Fackenheim, who was literally a victim of the Holocaust, a survivor of the Holocaust himself, and wrote about what the experience of the Holocaust meant to modern philosophy and Jewish thought. And he was I think the first to actually call the Holocaust a unique event in human history. And he later changed that to unprecedented. And the reason he did is because while he understood that there were some unique aspects of the Holocaust, I mean, never before did you have the finest minds of the medical, legal, engineers come together at a conference like they did in Wannsee and then prescribe the systematic murder of another people. Or never before in human history did you have trains that should have been going to help the German front against Russia divert to murder more Jews in Auschwitz. So he's saying that those are actually unprecedented acts. He's saying, but at the same time, you don't want to render it so unprecedented that it ceases to be useful to understanding how it can happen again. And so we have to be able to have the conversation at once that says, yes, this was different, but also what does it mean for us today and how can we use that understanding? And I think Nicole Hannah-Jones does that in a way in her rendering of slavery. She's saying, like, you shouldn't really talk about it in comparison or understand it with other events in human history. I think you actually have to go through that analysis, even if at the end of the day you said this really was different than other forms of slavery. But you can't make the discussion itself taboo, because then you prevent it from actually informing our modern day sensibilities.
No, look, I argue all the time chattel slavery in the United States was a specific, unique system of brutality and horror.
Yeah.
And we've seen similar systems in other places. And this isn't going to, okay, well, there were people in Africa that engaged in the slave trade amongst themselves, or people in Europe that did that. There was another form of systemic slavery, the systemic slave trade of Black people, and that's the trans-Saharan slave trade. So I think we actually do need to look at that and look at, okay, what actually led to the brutal system of chattel slavery in the United States? And it wasn't the slave trade between different African peoples. It was actually the trans-Saharan slave trade. It gets ignored and brushed under the rug all the time. And this is why my take is that her scholarship is sloppy or lazy, because it ignores that. And I don't think you address a historical event, no matter how terrible, without looking at the roots that caused it, just for the reason that you just said, to ensure it doesn't happen again. Certain things happened that led to people thinking it was okay not just to own other people, but to brutalize them like they did.
Yeah.
And,
So yeah. So let me ask you though. So we saw what the Florida the controversial piece in the Florida African American History Standard, or the Florida slavery curriculum, and you saw the similar quote in the African American AP Studies class. Do you think that that point should not be in the curriculum?
I think it should be in the curriculum, but this also depends on what the goal of the curriculum is. If it's to actually teach students about everything that came out of and the system of chattel slavery, then of course you keep it in. If the goal is actually to teach kids that people that were slaves were only slaves, that they were disempowered victims, and there was an all-powerful oppressor that controlled everything they did, even what they thought, and squashed all forms of resiliency within them, then you'd want to take it out. And the pessimistic side of me thinks that those who are arguing and ranting and railing against that specific point in the curriculum are doing it possibly just because of that. The ideology that they want to push gets discredited by any form of people having some form of resiliency in spite of the horrific conditions that they live under. And I'm more, I lean more towards the side of, strengths-based approach, empowerment-based approach, where we can acknowledge, recognize, call out brutality and horrific circumstances, and still acknowledge and recognize resiliency that individual people hold.
Yeah. There was one other controversial piece of the curriculum. It was about insurrections that took place during slavery. And it said that violence committed to and by Black slaves, I think is the language you use, or something to that effect. And there are people, and I think it's a fair critique, to say, well, you're equating the violence that was done to Black slaves with that which was done by Black slaves against their captives. I think that's a fair critique of it. I think that there are things that probably should be modified in that curriculum, and that was one of them. I just think, and maybe that's not what they were trying to communicate, but it's what was communicated. Thoughts on that?
Perhaps, but I mean, slave revolts were violent. That was the point of them. I don't think that there's anything. I mean, I don't think that's a bad thing, and I'm not saying that I wouldn't be on the side of the revolters if I were held as property and brutalized. But to pretend that wasn't violent, I mean, they weren't like, oh, here's a flower, now let us run away. Come on, it's ridiculous.
Right. There's probably a way of saying it that doesn't sound like a moral equation of the two.
I agree. I mean, there isn't. That isn't a. I would never want it to be painted as being equivalent to people who think it's okay to own people as property and brutalize them. But I also don't want to. I don't think that we need to color code language or make it so soft that we're not acknowledging that violence was violence. I mean, that's where we get into the arguments where people say words are violence. And I always say the only people that say that are people who have never known real violence. Right. I think it's a silly argument.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, this is always complicated, and navigating the culture wars and a nuanced voice is so challenging, because people want to immediately accuse you of both sidesism, and as if you're saying that, well, of course, there were good things that came out of slavery, and that you're equating that with the horrors of slavery. Obviously, people of goodwill would not argue that. We're just trying to make sense of a very complex curriculum and trying to and a narrative and think about how to teach it in a way that kids can understand and appreciate, but at the same time give them some room for intellectual wrestling that needs to take place.
I mean, I always say the problem with our public schools, one of the problems with our public school system in the United States is it's become a political football. And I'm not a fan of kids being used, as the rope and tug of war between some partisan battle. And it's not like I'm some Ron DeSantis fan. I think he's just as guilty of doing that as people, on the far left that argue against him. And when it comes down to it, that's not what schools are for. Schools are to teach kids things. They grow up to be critical thinkers and happy, productive members of communities and societies in which they live. I think that the rest kind of needs to be put aside. And unfortunately, we're just seeing more of the partisanship flare up in the whole system of educating our next generations. And I think it's that's sad. That's a tragedy.
Yeah, Yuval Levin, who is a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and is the editor of the journal National Affairs, really brilliant, insightful man, wrote this article that I reread in the last couple of days because we're all going to be reading it at a retreat we do in September. And he talks about one of the main problems with what we're dealing with, and probably the best solution if we could ever get there, is that people are politicizing every institution. Like every institution then becomes a platform for performance rather than to do its core function. So you end up with schools that become a platform for the culture wars over gender and so forth, rather than sticking with the basics. The corporation becoming a platform for arguments about privilege rather than there are issues that can come up in a corporation around diversity and atmosphere and culture and everything else that need to be addressed, but they're turned into this sort of ideological platform instead. And we're seeing that in so many institutions. They're not staying in their lane. These institutions,
I think the real issue with school is that comes at a cost, and the cost is kids learning. Like it's coming at the cost of educating kids, because instead of them being educated, what's happening is they become kind of wrapped up in this culture war, and we're going to see the price of that in the next few years if we haven't already.
Yeah, and the question is there a way out? Like, is there a way of trying to get institutions to stay in their lane? We were in Israel together. We visited a hospital. Maybe I said this on a previous podcast, but not everybody would have heard it. So I'm going to say it again anyway. We met at a hospital. Remind me of the hospital. You always remember, and I never do.
We were in Nahariya. I don't remember the name of it.
Yeah. There's a hospital that had a lot of Syrian wounded in Israel, and the president of the hospital is an Israeli Arab, I believe Muslim, but he might be Christian. I can't remember.
He was Muslim.
He was Muslim, right? And he was talking about how he manages the diversity of this institution. There's a lot of Israeli Muslims, Christians, Jews there. There are Druzes, there are Russian Jews, Ethiopian Jews, and he said that there are two type of people who work that come to this hospital. There are patients and there are caretakers. Thank you, Mars Chung. It was the Galilee Medical Center. Thank you very much. And he said, like, those are the two types of people we have. So what he's basically saying is, in order to perform the function of our hospital to take care of patients, we are going to suppress very intentionally differences of opinion about the conflict and so forth. We are going to, because we think it's so important that we treat our patients right. That is staying in your lane. It is saying that we have a job to do, and it's not to be a platform for the larger culture wars within our society. It's not to mitigate every difference of opinion or every difference in ethnic community narrative and so forth. So I think we can learn from that in the society. We've got to get institutions like schools to do their best, and there's no escaping some of this. I would say, like, there's no perfect way to teach about the Holocaust or slavery or anything else, because inevitably you're going to fall into sort of choices that you have to make about what to put in and what to put out. So you can't be perfectly objective, perfectly factual. That can't happen. But at least you can try to highlight the areas where there's legitimate disagreement and where there's consensus, and let students sort of navigate those tensions rather than spoon feeding them an exact opinion on them. What do you think? Am I wrong?
No, I agree with you. I think that it's easy to say, harder to do when you have certain educators or school administrators who actually believe that everything is political, and especially educating next generations. And their goal isn't the education of children. Their goal is the, I don't know, and indoctrination may not be the right word, but their goal is to have children only see things the way they see them, and everything else is bad and wrong. And I think that type of narrow-mindedness goes against the very core of educating.
Yeah. So when we talk about the culture wars, a lot of times the left wants to look at DeSantis and say, look at how he's using state power. And the right says, look at how our children are being indoctrinated. And I feel like we have two problems, not one. We have indoctrination, which is not done necessarily by the state, but it's being done on behalf of the state when teachers do it, or teachers unions do it, or principals adopt an indoctrination curriculum of some sort or other. And the other is censorship that can come from the state. And I think that we have to figure out sort of, a new way forward that allows issues and ideas to be debated thoughtfully, differences of opinion. So we have neither censorship nor indoctrination.
Well,
I don't think we're there yet. Yeah.
No, I don't. But I think we're not there yet. One of the reasons we're not there yet is both are profitable.
Yeah.
And to pretend that the state is the only one that holds power when we know how much power teachers unions hold is false. It's false. It's just that part isn't true. And this isn't saying which one should over the other, but acknowledge that both of those forces, organizations, hold a tremendous amount of power. And in this entire equation, the people that hold the least are the students, who are dependent on both the state and the educators.
Yeah. And they feed off each other. It's like a vicious cycle. The more censorship is, the more indoctrination is. The more indoctrination is, the more censorship. And so we're stuck in this vicious illiberal cycle coming from both the right and the left. And anytime anybody criticizes one or the other, they're immediately thought of as being, on the other side of the equation. And I think our job is to help break that cycle the best we can. We're gonna continue making arguments.
Yeah, and say that sometimes both sides are bad.
Exactly. Very frequently. Very much so. All right, great. Well, I think this has been a good, rich conversation, a nuanced one. I hope you all appreciated it. And it's August now. I think we're going to have one additional Contrarians podcast, but we're going to then take a break. But we'll be back in full force in September. In the meantime, everybody, Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, Brandy.
Shabbat Shalom.
Take care.